Well, I know a lot of you guys have been waiting for this, but today we're back to the Mini Model S. So, welcome back. I know a lot of you guys have been asking me about this and wondering when I'm going to get back to working on the Mini Model S project. Well, today's the day. It was just holidays and family stuff, business, getting my Model 3 repaired at the body shop. All of those things were sort of putting a delay on this project, but today I'm going to get back to it. So what we've got on the agenda today is to lay out the axles on the frame, to weld together the front axle with the steering, and get the caster set right, and also get the axles mounted to the frame. So that's what I'm going to get to now. So there's your basic layout, and so the first thing is to get the exact location of the rear axle onto the frame, and then I can work on the front and set that in relation to the rear axle. So in order to do that, go ahead and set the body on the frame. I'm going to go ahead and I'll raise up the frame, get it shimmed in the up position, get the body laid on it, and kind of work on it from there. This is just sort of a mock-up to get everything roughly where I think it may need to be. What I'm doing here is getting the front and rear, the positioning of the wheels lengthwise in relation to the wheel well. So we got to get that correct before we do much else. I think we're good right there. So now what I'm going to do is, now that I know the distance from the axle to the rear of the car, I'll get to the rear of the frame. I'll go ahead and get everything set, make sure the axle's square, and then I'll be welding down the bearing carriers to the frame. So I'm checking and double checking and triple checking that the axle is at a right angle to the frame, because once I get the position of this axle set, then the rest of the car will be affected by this, and this will dictate the front axle, and it's critical to get this part correct. So now I've currently got it set at 1 3/4 inches of ground clearance. So that should be enough. This is a street cart after all. It's not going to be off-road in the grass or anything else. So 1 3/4 inches should be plenty. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and tack down these bearing carriers. Okay, now I only tacked those primarily because if I put too much heat into there, it can adversely affect the ball bearings. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove the axle so that I can get the bearings out of the heat, and go ahead and continue welding. There we go. Now I should be able to lift this right out. There it is. So now you can see I've got the bearing carriers tack welded down to the frame, and they're actually surface area, or the surface of the clamps is actually the carriers is pretty flat, which Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's pretty good. So now I'm going to go ahead and weld the other side, and eventually I'll put gussets in here, but not today. That's a job for another day. So we'll go ahead and weld the other sides of that bearing carrier. Then I'll put the axle back in, and I'll begin on the front. But again, this was necessary, removing the axle, not only to provide access to weld the other side, but because too much heat will boil the grease out of the bearings, and you don't want that to happen. As a side note, I taught myself how to TIG weld, and it's a skill that I've learned to love, and it just really is a lot of fun, and it takes a lot of time to learn. Some people pick it up a lot quicker than I did, but still, I picked it up relatively quickly, and I just really enjoy doing it. There's sort of an art to it. What I'm doing here is there's gas that continues flowing out of the torch tip at the end of the weld, and I'm allowing that to blow onto the weld to help prevent oxidation and to give a little bit of cooling to the weld. Alright, now we'll let that cool just a little bit, and then I'll set the axle back in place and double check to make sure it's square, and then I'll begin on the front. Now, one nice thing about using split collars as bearing carriers, which normally you'll notice most people building their own carts will purchase axle bearing carriers, and those are typically a plate. It would be a plate about that big with holes around it and a bearing in the middle, and that requires welding a flat plate onto the frame that bearing carrier can slot into. And there's nothing wrong with those, they work fine, but what I use is just a simple split collar that I get at McMaster Car, and I use those as bearing carriers. I've done this on a number of other projects. They work wonderfully because, again, you can remove these caps and lift the axle right out as a unit. You don't have to slide it out. You can slide it out if you want. You can merely loosen the screws, and the whole bearings would slide right out. Also, if you look here, I've got on the axle, the bearing is located here, and then on either side is a split clamp. That clamp, each of those clamps, locates the axle left and right within that bearing. So, and then there's another split clamp here that the bearing rides in. All those split clamps, they're inexpensive to purchase, and they're wonderful because you can set the distance between the bearings and the offset of the axle left and right. The bearing offset can be adjusted within that clamp a little bit, maybe 1/4 of an inch, 6 millimeters left and right. And so not only am I building this cart from scratch, but I'm building all of the drive unit from scratch. So I'm adapting my own sprockets to wheel hubs and brake disc to a wheel hub there, and all of this is very, very custom. I made the axle myself and machined keyways in it, and so this is not just buy some go-kart parts and mount it. I'm doing a lot of this from scratch. Now, the front end, I'm using steering spindles from just standard go-kart steering spindles. I think I got them from Go Power Sports, but I don't remember. There's no sponsorship in this video or anything. Anyway, but the rear end is very, very custom. And I am using some go-kart components, but for the most part I'm making this from scratch. And again, these split clamps are wonderful for fabrication of this type. So there we go. And I'll lift the rear of the frame here. So, and there we go. We've got free spinning axle there. Excellent. Now I'll take the frame off the bench, and we'll go ahead and start assembling the front axle assembly. So these are the front spindles, and so they are just a standard axle and steering spindle assembly. There aren't any bearings in here. There are plastic bushings, but this is what I'll be using, and these plastic spacers are designed to you can set the offset for different wheels that you might be using. So the first thing to do is to mount the front wheels onto the hubs. Make sure that we've got the right offset, which I want this steering arm as close to the wheel as I can practically get it. And we'll get that set first, and then we'll continue on. Now, so it looks like this spacer is actually perfect for the wheel that we've got, with it set all the way in place. You can see the spindle arm gets very close to the tire right there, and so I mean I could shim it out a little bit if I really want, but what that means is we have far more axle than we need, so I'll be cutting that off short because there's no reason to have that much axle hanging out, so I'll do that on both. Also, there's a little bit of axle non-threaded area there, and the nut won't go down far enough, so I'm going to need to use a spacer or a couple of washers in order to compensate for that. These are a narrower hub than a lot of people will use on these spindles, so they make sure that they give you plenty of axle length to compensate for that. So what I've decided to do is to go ahead and make my own aluminum spacers to compensate for that thread distance. And I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to make it a single spacer for each wheel that's a little bit longer than this plastic spacer, because what that will allow, it'll bring this, I want to bring that hub closer so that we've got to the threads there, and you'll notice that that steps the hub over a little bit. Well, so let's see, we've got, with the wheel pressed onto the hub, we have the steering arm gets really close to the tire. Now I want it to be close, but I have a feeling that might be a little bit too close. So if I make a longer spacer, it'll step that out away from the wheel to a more safe distance and also compensate for that thread interference issue. So I'm going to measure and see how much longer I need that spacer to be. Looks like 1/4 inch, which is about 6 millimeters. So, and this material has the exact same inner diameter as the diameter of the axle. It's kind of thick wall, but I only need a small piece. So, need a small piece for each axle. This length plus 1/4 inch. So we'll go ahead and pull the bandsaw out and start cutting. There's one spacer cut. So we'll go ahead while the other one's cutting. We'll test fit this spacer, hub, and you'll notice that it is just at the end of the threads there. Perfect. So the next thing is I will cut off the axle stub there. So got our safety glasses here and hearing protection. spacer number 2. Now, one thing to remember, whenever you cut something, it's going to be nice and hot. So you don't want to pick it up with your bare hands. So always pick it up with pliers or wear gloves. And for those of you that are wondering why I don't have work gloves on right now, a couple of reasons. One is when I'm using a cutoff wheel, even though it would be nice to have protection from sparks or whatever, they're cumbersome, and power tools tend to slip out of my hands when I'm wearing them. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. But again, that's nice and hot. So now we'll cut the other one off, but you can see the difference in axle length there. Go ahead and cut the other one. Cut off, and one's a little longer than the other, but I'll be grinding it down anyway. And that's one thing to point out. Once you've cut off a threaded bolt or axle like this, it's going to be difficult to get the nut to thread on because you've damaged the thread. So you want to grind it parallel or flat at a true 90, and then you also want to bevel the edges so that the threads will gradually catch the nut. So we'll do that now. So there we go. I went ahead and ground it off, and then I also ground a taper, a bevel in the threads. So, see, nut threads on real nice. So we'll go ahead and try this one out here. Spacer, hub, and nut. And yes, I'm using an adjustable wrench. Get over it. I don't happen to have sockets this size. So there we are, one completed front spindle and hub assembly. So we'll go ahead and lay the wheel on it. And there's our clearance between the steering arm. You can see the nut inside there with the right length axle. So we'll go ahead and dress the other axle and then put it all together. So, got our homemade spacer, hub, and axle nut. There we are. And we'll test the offset on this one. And same clearance as the other. So now that we've got our two spindle and hub assemblies done, the next thing is to calculate the width. I'm going to mount the wheels, screw the wheels to the hubs, and then calculate the width between the wheels, between the tires, to get the right length between these uprights, and in order to set it in the frame and get the track width the same for the front as it is for the rear. So we'll do that next. Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and put the chassis back up on the table here. So I'm going to double check the width between the fender edges. So the width between the fender edges on the back is 26 inches. And same in the front. So the track width for the rear is 25 inches. So we'll do the same for the front, 25-inch track width. So it looks like we need roughly 9 inches between these uprights. I'll adjust that a tiny bit, but it looks like we need about 9 inches here. So I'm gonna, yeah, it looks like 9 inches between the two. So we'll go ahead and cut that. So I'm using this 1-inch box steel with 1/8 inch wall that'll be welded between the steering uprights to achieve that the tie between the two. Very, very strong, very sturdy, and since it's such a small piece, the weight of this heavy bar won't matter. Now I'm making the front end out of steel rather than aluminum because, well, first off, it was basic go-kart components that I could buy. They were already steel, but also there's one support between both wheels, and doing it in aluminum I'd have to oversize everything, and this is just easier to work with steel. And also Tesla does use suspension hard points and different things that are made out of steel, so for certain very high load areas steel is good. Now on the rear end, the rear axle is it's a large diameter aluminum tube, thick walled. It's plenty strong, and you don't have all the steering pivot and that to worry about. So, but for the front, steel is definitely the best material to use. Again, I'm only using a small amount of steel on this chassis, so the added weight shouldn't be a big deal. One thing I forgot to do was calculate the front ride height. Alright, so now I'm going to lay out our front axle. And in this case, I'm going to just use the edge of the table here as a guide. But we've got our steering uprights and the cross tie here. And I'll be using the edge of the table as a guide to weld it together in that basic shape there. Now I'm going to put, there's going to be caster, probably, I don't know, 15 degrees I would think of caster in, and I'll do that on the frame mount for this. I'm not going to deal with the caster individually. I want to make sure the caster is equal between both wheels, so I'm going to lay it out using the table as a guide to hold everything nice and square and straight. And then I'll deal with the caster when the whole assembly is on the car and I can adjust it to compensate. I'm also going to make sure that it's got proper Ackerman. Now I'm not necessarily going to measure, and there are some specific there's specific methods to measure to get Ackerman perfect. I'm not going to make the Ackerman perfect, but it will have Ackerman steering. Now Ackerman means when you're turning right, the right wheel will turn further than the left because it's cutting a tighter circle. So zero Ackerman means both wheels are moving equally, are steering equally, and it will steer that way, but Ackerman allows the inner wheel to turn more than the outer wheel, so it'll turn further. And so when you turn right, the inside wheel will always turn tighter than the outside wheel. Also, you want a tiny bit of toe in, so maybe 15 degrees of caster, which is the tilt of the steering pivot. You can go anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees, but I'll probably settle for 15 degrees of caster. And I'll set the Ackerman, a little bit of toe in, and then camber. Camber is adjusting this, and I don't want any camber on this part. I'll just set it with 0 camber, and so we'll go ahead and get to that. So I have these right angle magnets that can hold the proper angle of the uprights. Looks good. We'll go ahead and tack it. Now for this step, I'm not using the TIG welder. I'm using the wire feed MIG welder. Steel is easy to MIG weld, and it's easiest to tack it, and then I'll go ahead and finish welding it after I've got it tacked. I may break out the TIG welder to do the finish welds to make it look pretty, but for tacking purposes, the MIG works best. Yeah. So there's our front axle, and we will go ahead and do a simple test assembly to make sure the overall measurement is indeed correct. Pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and set the body over it just to make sure it's going to fit inside the body of the car. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and fabricate a tie rod to tie the two uprights together. This will not be the final steering arm. It's just going to be a temporary rod just to get it set so that I can work on it without the wheels flopping around independently of each other. Alright, so what I've done here is I made a temporary, just a temporary tie rod just to tie the front wheels together so that they're not flopping around. And so there'll be actual tie rods with heim joints and that, but I just wanted to tie the wheels together to keep them from flopping around so I can work on the car more easily. So we'll go ahead and lay out the chassis now. So that's the basic layout of the chassis. So what I'm going to do now is measure the exact distance from the front wheel well to the rear wheel well, and I'll just use the edge of the wheel wells as a guide. So it is just a tiny bit under 30 inches. Check it to the front as well. Yeah, just a tiny bit under 30 inches. So, set this here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the table where the axle should. So what I did here is made an angle finder. I've settled on 10 degrees of caster for the front end, mainly because of the narrowness of it. More caster than that wants to kind of angle the chassis to one side. So I settled on 10 degrees, and it's very easy for me to set my cutoff saw at various angles. So I set the cutoff saw at 10 degrees. I cut off just a piece of stock I had laying around. Now I can lay that up against my square tube front axle and get the angle set just right. Yeah, that's going to be great. Great for finding my, assuring that my angle is correct. Now the next thing is I have to be able to fasten this steel axle assembly to the aluminum frame. So I'm going to use some steel angle and cut and shape that to weld to this axle, and then it will screw down to the frame. My camera ran dead, my GoPro there. So sorry, but you guys missed the welding together of the front end assembly. So it is at a 10-degree caster. That is to tip the axle back 10 degrees, and it mounts to the frame here at the nose, and so it will screw down to the frame with 8 quarter-inch diameter screws, and so there's the layout of it. Now the way I'm screwing it down is using these threaded inserts. So what you do is you drill a hole, and then you take the threaded insert here, and you thread it onto the end of the tool. There we go. A little awkward. I'm holding the camera and the tool at the same time. So then you go ahead and insert the tool into the frame, and then you squeeze the arms together and it presses the insert in. So I'll go ahead and do that. Once it's pressed in, you spin this knob to unthread the stud at the end of the tool from the threaded insert. And it's like a pop rivet in that it goes into the hole and it flares on the back side of the hole. So if you look at the insert, the lines there, that area crushes, and it pop rivets itself basically right into the hole there. So I've got these other 4 to do, and then I will go ahead and install the front axle, and yeah, see how it goes. Install the axle, put the front wheels on, and then I should have the rolling chassis complete to show you guys. So there's the front axle bolted down nice and snug. So I'll go ahead and put the front wheels on, and we should have a complete rolling chassis. All right, well, there's the complete rolling chassis for you. Turned out really, really well so far. So, really proud of that. So let's walk around front here and take a close look. So again, this is just a temporary steering tie rod that I put on just to hold the wheels steady while I work on the chassis. But ultimately, there'll be the steering arm will come up here, and then there'll be tie rods from there to each wheel. So it's coming right along. There's the rear end, just sort of tacked together. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there will be gussets here. This area will be filled in, so that will be gusseted. It's not just this tiny weld that'll be holding each side. That's just tacked on for now. So the overall weight, it's very, very light, being all aluminum, including the rear axle is not only aluminum, it's hollow aluminum. So, yep. I am looking forward to getting it all together, and not sure how long it'll take. It might be another 6 months or so before it's actually running, but I'll keep you guys updated as often as I can, and yeah, pretty exciting. So let me know if you have any questions on it. I'll be doing my best to answer whatever I can. Thanks, guys. Take it easy. Bye-bye now.